According to Brent Johnson, we don't have an affordability crisis, we have an inequality crisis. The problem with our monetary system here in the United States is that due to being a nation of debtors, in other words, constantly taking today and robbing from our tomorrow, we have no reverse gear, meaning that reducing prices in the U.S., deflation, causes banks and financial markets to collapse. And our system is designed that we must always grow. But Brent says that Trump is going to try to solve the high price issue with wages going up. But the chance of us getting both prices down and earnings up is very small. Listen as Brent outlines what he believes will happen to our overall economy, the dollar, the 10-year Treasury bond, which, by the way, affects mortgage interest rates, and the potential of a war with China. You'll hear why Brent says pain is coming, and the first part of 2025 will be a very tough time. Brent says Trump will have to go fast with policies and not look back, and we won't start seeing benefits of a Trump administration until 2026. I hope you enjoy the interview. Brent, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
You know, we haven't spoke since the election. I have to ask you, were you shocked that Trump won?
You know, I wasn't shocked, but it's really kind of funny because in 2016, I predicted that he would win and he lost, or he won. And in 2020, I predicted he would win and he lost. And in 2024, I just really didn't know. I kind of thought that he would, but I didn't have the conviction that I had the prior two times. So I was really kind of, just kind of sitting back and watching. And it was, it was quite something to see because you kind of get the gut instinct that that's the way it's going to go, but you just never know.
Yeah, I have to admit I was surprised. So my wife and I were it was split. I said I wasn't so sure, she was sure, and so we'll see what happens now. But for many that don't know who you are, you're a dad, you're a husband, you're a money manager, and you live in Puerto Rico, and I know that firsthand because I came to see you. But you're big in the finance world, and you're known as one who believes in the strength of the U.S. dollar over any other fiat currency in the world. And that regardless of how much debt we incur as a nation or how much we devalue the dollar by printing more, regardless of countries wanting to reduce the dependency on the dollar, you believe that the dollar will remain the world's reserve currency, I think, for a while. Is that a fair statement to say?
Yeah, that's fair. And it's kind of one of those things when you, if I step back and look at it from a bigger perspective, it's kind of one of those things where if you analyze the United States in isolation and you look at its policies and its fiscal position and the amount of debt that it's borrowed and, kind of these crazy programs that the politicians have put in place. And there's really no conclusion you can come to other than this is a really bad situation that's going to end in a disaster. The problem is we don't live in a vacuum. It's a big world, right? And currencies trade relative to each other. And so when you do the same level of analysis on the other countries, you quickly realize that they have almost all the same problems that the United States has, but they don't have nearly the advantages that the United States does. For all of the problems that the United States has, we still have an incredible amount of resources, economic weapons, military weapons, rule of law. And I know a lot of people will say, well, those have all degraded over the last 10, 20, 30 years. And, I guess I'm kind of sympathetic to that argument, but again, it's a relative basis. Where is it better? And if you can't find some place that is better, then that thing that you're looking at is probably going to outperform. And that's kind of the conclusion that I have come to. And that, I certainly think we have a number of issues. I think they're sort of in the process of being addressed. How well they're addressed, the timeline it takes to address them, that's a bit of a wild card. But when I look around at other countries around the world, they're in the same position. And if I had to bet on one place, I'm happy to bet on America.
Yeah. Well, just for some context, you've been in wealth management for a long time. You were a financial auditor for Philip Morris Management Company in New York City, auditing the company's headquarters as well as its subsidiaries in Germany, Hong Kong, Richmond, Virginia.
Yep.
I mean, Brent, you're a smart guy. I mean, I'm not just saying that. I enjoy speaking with you. I learn a lot from you, and I think so does my audience. Um, but just to kind of start us off here, are you okay? I mean, would you feel comfortable giving us an idea of about what you're currently managing as far as wealth right now, the amount?
Oh yeah, sure. I can tell you that I manage approximately $175 million. Now it fluctuates a little bit with what's going on in the markets and everything, but that's generally. I've got about 15 clients. They're all very high net worth. So it's not a large business, but it's a good business, and I take it very serious. I don't. It's funny. I don't take myself very seriously, but I take my business very seriously. I feel like you kind of have to laugh and joke in this business or else you'll go crazy. So I'm often sarcastic and joking around and kind of laughing at things that I see going on in the world. But it's a very serious job, right? At the end of the day, you're trying to protect somebody's lifestyle and, the hard work that they've put in. They've entrusted you with their capital. And so I take that very seriously. And that actually factors into kind of a big epiphany or realization that I had about 10 years ago. Was I realized after the global financial crisis that I was very upset with the way it all went down. I was very upset with the bailouts. I was very upset with the institutionalization of the losses, but then you would still give the bankers the big bonuses. I just didn't think it was fair, and I didn't think it was what America was all about. And so I kind of became this, I don't know, advocate or financial justice warrior, shaking my fist at the air, and this isn't the way it should be. And that probably went on for 3, 4, 5 years until I realized that I was moralizing in my clients' portfolios rather than just trying to grow their portfolio. I mean, they didn't hire me to be a financial justice warrior. They hired me to analyze the world as it is, protect them on the downside, and participate in the upside. And even though I'm friends with all my clients, we don't necessarily all see the world the exact same way. We don't all necessarily have the exact same political affiliations or religious affiliations. And so for me to put my own personal ethical spin or moral spin or political spin into their portfolio would in many ways be a breach of fiduciary duty. And once I kind of realized that was happening, and I just kind of stepped back and tried to just be completely objective and kind of a mercenary about it all, everything cleared up. The clouds parted, the veil kind of got lifted from my eyes, and I felt like I could see the world a lot more clearly. And, since that time, I'm not saying I've done everything perfect, and I make a lot of mistakes along the way, but I've never been completely confused about what's going on in the world. It's a lot of it has made sense since I kind of made that realization. And it's really hard to do. So I'm not sitting here, trying to be condescending towards people who are in that same situation. I would just say, to the extent that is happening in your portfolio, my guess is that it has negative consequences for the portfolio. And so the extent that you can remove emotion from your analysis, the better off you're going to be. Now, that sounds easy to do, and that sounds very, common sense, but it's very hard. It is very hard. And so, and I still struggle with it from time to time. Sometimes I catch myself reacting emotionally rather than reacting logically. And so, what I have tried to do since that time is rather than trying to be right about everything, try to be prepared for everything. I mean, the bottom line is I don't know what's going to happen. I think I have a better view on things than a lot of people, but I don't know for sure. And so I have a system figured out to where if everything goes okay and we don't have a big crisis and assets trend up and to the right, my clients are going to make money and, things are going to be okay. But I've also figured out a way that if we do get this terrifying drawdown or a crash or a recession or, all of these numerous negative things that could happen, if we do get one of those, I'm not going to be surprised by it. And I will have been prepared for it. Or at least I will have prepared for it as much as I can. And that allows me to sleep at night. And again, it allows me to kind of smile and laugh at things, even though the world is crazy. And, we'll see how the next few years go.
Yeah. Well, today I'd like to talk about your thoughts on a Trump presidency, interest rates, inflation, home affordability, a central bank digital currency, and the potential of war with China. So we'll kind of start out with Trump here. Um, I guess, Brent, the big question that I have is, do you believe that we have an affordability crisis in the U.S.?
Well, I think we certainly have an inequality crisis in the U.S. So it depends on which group you're talking about. If you're talking about the higher ups, they don't have an affordability crisis. I mean, they don't. Inflation doesn't hurt them that hard. But if you're talking about the blue collar worker and the average citizen, then of course, I mean, I think it would be very hard to say that is not the case. And it would be very out of touch to say that is not the case. And going back to the election, I think that is why Trump got elected. Because in many ways, again, regardless of what you think of Trump and Kamala and all the politicians, the bottom line is that in a very weird and perhaps surprising way, over the last, at least as long as I can remember, I was born in the 70s, kind of grew up in the 80s. And at that time period, the Democrats represented the common man, and the Republicans kind of represented the big business and the billionaires and the, capitalistic class. And I don't know exactly when that switched, probably over the last 10 years, maybe we could argue 15 years. But certainly since, the 2000s, when I came into business, that has switched. And, the Republicans now identify more with the common man and the person in the flyover states, and the Democrats identify with the liberal elite of the big cities. I think the reason that Trump won, and not just Trump won, they got control of Congress as well, and I think it's because, in many ways, the Democrats were out of touch with the common person. They tried to tell them everything is good. Kamala said, "I'm not going to change anything that Biden did. I think he did a fantastic job." And, and I think the average person was like, "What the hell are you talking about?" Right. Yeah. And if you look back through history, it's those types of environments that populist leaders always arise. And I think you could easily classify Trump as a populist leader. When he comes out and he says, "Listen, the people in Washington and New York City aren't listening to you, and I will listen to you, and I will fight for you. Even if you don't necessarily love them as a person, you like what they're saying." Right. And so, getting back to your question on inequality and cost of living, or I think you termed it a pricing crisis. I think that's largely why Trump won. And I think, the policies that he is at least talking about putting in place are addressing a number of those issues. Now, I think the real question becomes of how well can he implement the policies that he's talking about, and how quickly, if at all, will they work? But I do think that's a big issue. I think it's a big reason why Trump was elected. And I think, based on his cabinet pick so far and what he has said post-election, I think that's kind of high up on his priority list of things to take a closer look at.
What would you like to see him accomplish over the next 4 years?
Well, this is going to sound silly, but in some ways, he's already accomplished one thing that I think is incredibly necessary in order to be successful. And that is a positive attitude and mindset. And so I suppose if you are a Democrat, or if you're from kind of the circles that voted for Kamala, perhaps you think differently. But if you look at a map of the counties of the whole country, and you look and see which ones voted red and which ones voted blue, it is almost entirely red except for the big cities. And so all of those people, or not all of them, many of those people in those counties that voted red have a feeling, and I've talked to many of these people. I grew up in that area. I grew up in a very rural, agricultural centric area in Nebraska. And, all of my friends and all of my friends' parents were blue collar workers, farmers. They worked on the railroad. They worked on the power plant. They were teachers and firemen. And I think a lot of those people didn't feel heard. And with Trump coming in, I think they feel much like we felt back in the early 80s when Trump got elected or when Reagan got elected. I can remember being a kid in the 70s and there was the inflation and there was this, I was pretty young, but I can kind of remember when when Reagan came into power, there was a change in mood for the whole country. And I'm not going to say that this is exactly the same, but it reminds me of it. And I think that is crucial if we're going to address the problems that we have. So this is a very long way of answering your question, but I think changing the attitude of the average person was fundamentally important. And I think that it so far is happening. Hopefully that can continue. The other thing that I would like to see him accomplish is I think for him to have a chance and not get eaten up by the swamp again, I think he needs to hit the ground running, going 500 miles an hour and do exactly what he was going to say and do exactly what he said he was going to do. I think if he slows down or if he hedges, he's going to get eaten alive. And the analogy I'll use is President Milei in Argentina. So I don't know to the extent people are familiar with this, but for years and years and years, Argentina has been mired in many socialist policies and financial crises and incredible rates of inflation and government waste. And a very populist, politician came on the scene a couple years ago and said he was going to change everything, said he was going to slash the budget, he was going to kick out the waste, and he was going to shut down the central bank. And he made a number of these just grand proclamations. And I think a lot of people thought that he wouldn't win. And even if he didn't win, he wouldn't go through with what he said he was going to do because it was really dramatic. But he has done basically exactly what he said he was going to do. And he keeps going. And so far, Argentina has seen a remarkable turnaround. And I think the only thing that's keeping him from getting eaten alive is that he just keeps going 100 miles an hour and doesn't stop. And so I would use that analogy for Trump. I think he has the mandate. All you got to do is look at that map of the election. He has the mandate. He's been putting people in place that so far at least appear, to kind of share his vision of what he wants to do. And I think if he hits the ground running and going 100 miles an hour and doesn't stop, he's got a chance. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. I expect there to be some significant volatility, in 2025. I think in many ways, 2025 could look a lot like 2022. Remember, if people remember back 2 or 3 years ago, we had higher rates of inflation than we have today. Now, I think people probably will disagree with me on this, but I think in many ways, the Fed has done a pretty good job of addressing the inflation that was out of control in 2022. Now, it doesn't mean we don't still have high prices, and it doesn't mean that inflation is no longer a problem, but it's not rising at the rate that it was back then. But the policies that the Federal Reserve put in place in order to address that inflation caused a lot of problems in the first 6 to 9 months of 2022. At one point in 2022, stock markets were down 20 to 50%, depending on which one you were looking at. Unemployment started to tick up a little bit as a result. The recessionary fears were on the table. And my guess, but ultimately, it did, well, again, I know people are going to take issue with this, but it got it under control. Maybe it didn't solve it, but it did stop the surge in inflation. It didn't completely wreck the economy. We're still doing okay. Unemployment is still low. Growth is still happening. The stock market's at all-time high. So even though it caused some short-term pain, it didn't lead to a total disaster, at least not yet. And I think Trump's new policies will likely have some kind of similar effect. I would expect the first 6 to 9 months of 2025 to be very challenging. I don't think it will just all go smoothly. But I think, from anywhere from 9 to 18 months into this, we will start to see some of the benefits of it. And, but again, I think it's going to necessitate him to follow through on his policies. It's going to necessitate him to to do the tariffs. It's going to necessitate him to follow through with Elon and Vivek running the Doge committee, right, to decrease the size of the government. He's going to have to appoint people in his cabinet who are going to do what he said on the campaign trail that he said he would do. And so I actually think there's this thing called situational awareness, right? And what it means is that you have to understand that the environment you're in order to make the best decisions to get out of it. And while I have many problems with Trump on a personal level, I think he is the right guy out of him and Kamala for the current situation that the United States is in. It doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. Doesn't mean there's not going to be a lot of gnashing of teeth and pain along the way. But if you do want to address the things that you brought up and the problems that you see, I think Trump is going to be better able to solve those than Kamala would have been.
Yeah, I just hope that everyone looks at it from a bipartisan approach and the well-being of, like you had said, our middle class, essentially. I hope you're enjoying the interview so far. I just wanted to take a brief moment and let you know that this podcast is brought to you by SachsRealty.com. Here at Sachs Realty, we're committed to bringing you the best real estate education and helping buyers and sellers achieve their real estate goals. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please consider doing so now. And don't forget, we're on every major social media platform, so you can follow us there as well. Now back to the show. When you and I had sat down in Puerto Rico, one of the things that we spoke about, or when you were talking about the monetary system, you had indicated that we really don't have a reverse gear, that causes a lot of problems, because one of the questions is, and we talk about disinflation year over year and whether the Fed has curbed, I guess there could be arguments as to, the cost of living is still extremely high. People, they don't really want to hear that, inflation is down year over year. They really want to see price deflation. But you speak about how, there really is no reverse gear. In America, deflation doesn't sit well. Something is broken when that happens and it causes a chain reaction. How do we, Brent, regain affordability in a country where housing costs are outrageous, groceries are, being financed on credit cards, and it costs you an arm and a leg to have your car repaired?
Yeah. Well, so there's a couple things. You can address it with prices, or you can address it with earnings. Now, the simple fact is that prices very rarely go down, right? And that's why, even though inflation is typically seen as the growth in prices. And so while inflation, the growth in prices have come down, the prices themselves have not come down, right? And they rarely do. They rarely do. I'm not saying that they can't, but they rarely do. And typically when prices do come down, it's the result of the system trying to go into a reverse gear, even though there isn't one. And when prices come down under that scenario, they don't come down a little bit, they crash, they collapse, right? And that's when you get housing prices going down 30 or 40%. You get the stock market going down 30 or 40%. You get the price of used cars going down 30 or 40% because nobody can afford them, or new cars going down because nobody can afford them. And unfortunately, what that leads to is a financial crisis because, as you noted, and as we've discussed before, the design of the system is one that must grow. The system design itself must grow. And the reason it must grow, without going into too long of detail here, is because we have a debt-based monetary system where money's loaned into existence, and that new money that is loaned into existence has interest attached to it. So if you had all the money in the world, but you also had to accept all the debt in the world, you'd be broke. Because you can never pay off all the debt. You can only try to outrun it. And eventually it will get you. And so how do we address the pricing issue in the US is, unfortunately, it's going to be very difficult to get prices to come down without creating a bad recession or probably higher unemployment, right? Now, I think in some ways that's what the Fed was trying to do when they were taking rates from 0 to 5.5%. They were trying to slow the economy down. They were trying to, get prices to come down. Even on a couple of occasions, Powell said we will probably have higher unemployment, so people will lose their jobs. But when you think about that, that's how. If people are losing their jobs, if unemployment's rising, if corporate profitability is falling, and interest rates are higher, so it costs more to service debt, then there's going to be less money sloshing around, and when there's less money sloshing around, then prices will come down. So it's interesting that many people want to have lower prices, but I don't know anybody that wants to lose their job, right? So it's really, really difficult. And so my guess, this isn't a guess, I mean, he's pretty much said this, is that Trump wants to bring good jobs back to the United States. So rather than solving it on a price decrease basis, he's going to try to solve it on a wage increase basis, right? And so I think he's going to try to bring wages higher. He's going to try to bring good jobs back to the United States. The problem is that trying to address the cost of living problem from an earnings perspective is that the policies that will make earnings go up probably also make prices go up. Right? Now, maybe you can do it in a way that prices don't skyrocket, but the idea that you're going to get earnings up and prices down is pretty small.
Yeah.
Right? Very, very unlikely. So I think he's going to focus on getting jobs back.
Yeah. I want to pull a chart up here because, I completely agree with what you're saying. Wages have to increase in order. I mean, I see it every day with trying to sell people their first home. I mean, it's crazy. And, but if we look at this chart here, this is basically median salaries in the U.S. from 2017 to 2019. Median wages grew about 12.5%, and over a 2-year period. So there was a slight drop from in wage growth. Actually went down a little bit from 2019 to 2020. And then we had the pandemic boom. So if we expand this view to the maximum view here, we have the pandemic, we'll call the pandemic boom. And from 2020 to 2023, wages grew about 18% in that period. And, clearly during that pandemic boom period, median salary growth grew faster in a shorter period of time than any other period in history since 1974. And I guess the biggest, kind of question that I have here is, do you think that we are coming head to head with, AI, another round of automation? There are some that believe that we'll see 50% of jobs cut in the next, 10 years because, robots will be doing and AI will be doing what human beings are doing now. I mean, do you see a possibility to where we can get wage growth up, or do you think, or are you concerned that businesses at this point are saying, I'm looking for a way to get rid of people, not bring more, or yet still pay them more?
Well, I think in some ways, creating new jobs is going to be bringing jobs that currently aren't here back to the United States. And so,
but won't that take a lot of time?
Well, it's not going to happen right away, right? And that's the thing is, Trump can start this, but the reality is, and this is why I say that the first part of 2025, or maybe even all of 2025, I think is probably going to be a bit difficult because it's not going to happen right away. And again, looking at that chart, it's a good thing that wages have gone up, because if wages hadn't gone up at that rate, then the inflation would have been even more painful than it was, right? I mean, and I'm not saying it wasn't painful. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there listening to saying, well, my wages didn't go up 18% or whatever the number is. I don't know who got that raise, but it wasn't me. And so This is why I say that Trump has to go really fast and do as much as possible in as little time as possible, because there is going to be pain. And if he slows down or stops, everybody's going to point out the pain of the current moment. And that's when he's going to get stuck defending his policies. He doesn't really have time to defend his policies. He's just got to go, and not look back. So it's not going to be addressed in 2025. It might not even be addressed in 2026. But I think the hope is that, a year or two down the road, we start to see some alleviation of that of prices increasing faster than wages. The other thing I would say is, I don't know if you had planned to talk about this or not, but maybe this is a good time to mention it, is that I think there's a general view, and maybe this is just in my world, so maybe this isn't in the mainstream. But I know that many that see things differently than Trump sees them will say, well, Trump's not going to cure inflation because he's going to put these tariffs in. The only thing that's going to happen is it's going to boomerang back. Prices are going to rise, and it's going to crush the U.S. citizen. So all these ideas that he's going to crush inflation and also bring back jobs is just crazy. So there is some truth to that. And, again, there will be blowback. But I think way too often people just automatically assume every tariff is bad and automatically assume that it can't possibly work. And then you will often hear people refer to the last time the U.S. put a big trade policy like this in was 1930s, Smoot-Hawley. And what did we have? The Great Depression. Okay, so I think I don't think you can look at all tariffs as equal. And I think there's a way to put them on that doesn't necessarily crush everything right away. And I'm probably not going to have time to get into this third point that I'll make, but I'll just make the point, and we can come back to it if you want, is that even if the tariffs do lead to really big problems in the United States, they will create even bigger problems outside the United States. The idea that they're going to raise tariffs and it will only hurt the United States, but China will be fine and Russia will be fine and Brazil will be fine, and that's a pipe dream. Anybody who tells you that, just run the other way and, stay away from them, because you're going to get bad advice.
Yeah.
But coming back to the tariffs, the other thing is Trump's tariff policies will likely lead to the dollar getting stronger, not weaker. That's part of the reason you've seen the dollar rise so much post his election, because his policies will lead to fewer circulating dollars in the world. And as we talked the last time on this episode, like it or not, the entire world needs dollars, not just the United States. The whole world needs dollars. So if fewer dollars are circulating as a result of tariffs, that's going to lead to pressure of supply. Supply won't be as great as it is now. Price will rise. And so if our currency rises versus other foreign currencies, and we're importing those foreign currencies, even if there's a tariff on them and the prices rise, if our purchasing power versus those foreign goods has risen, perhaps it's not as big a boomerang as it otherwise would be. Now, if our currency was collapsing and we were putting on tariffs, and the imports were from a stronger currency to the dollar, and then there was a tariff put on top of them, then the economy and the citizens really getting hit. But if you can increase wages, have a stronger currency, and set it up in a way that those tariffs don't necessarily hit right away, and it doesn't totally stop them from coming in, then you can see some positive effects. The other thing is that part of the way to get jobs back here, and part of the way to get earnings going higher, is to have the foreigners who are building things in their own countries and shipping them here, build them here in the United States. And that's part of Trump's plan. If somebody is going to sell tires into the United States and they're getting ready to build a new factory in Korea or Taiwan or the Philippines or wherever it is, and they can build it in Arizona or Ohio or New Mexico or wherever it is, and therefore not pay the tariff and save 25 or 30%, then, there will be companies that build plants in America as a result of these tariffs. And it's already happening. So if anybody's out there saying, "Oh, they'll never come to the United States, they'll never be," well, they already are. So, you're wrong. And now, will it happen to the extent that Trump is saying it will? I don't know. We'll have to see. But my point that I would make is that for anybody who just automatically says tariffs are bad, I think you need to step back and be a little bit more objective. And then the other thing I'd say is the U.S. already deals with tariffs on a daily basis. It's just that typically it's other countries that are putting them on rather than the United States. And part of the policies that led to this inequality gap that we're discussing is the fact that over the last 30 or 40 years, the U.S. has outsourced all its manufacturing to countries who do use tariffs, and we haven't put any on of our own. So if you went to and that then led to jobs leaving, prices rising, right? Wages not rising at the same, right? And so if you're going to address those problems, you have to address them by doing the opposite of what has been done for 20 or 30 years. So you need to decide, do you want to address the problems and change things, or do you want to keep it the way it was? Now, pretty clear to me, Trump won because he doesn't want to keep things the way that they were. So for him to come in now and not change things would be, to abandon his mandate. And I think the people who are the loudest ones saying tariffs won't work are the ones who wanted to leave things the way they were and who didn't get elected, quite honestly. So, again, this won't be easy, Todd, but I think it has the possibility of working better than people expect.
What do you think about the Federal Reserve? Would this be something? So, in order to keep the dollar strong, would that mean that the Fed would have to do more quantitative tightening, and not printing more money, or what about interest rates? Like, wouldn't the Federal Reserve, need to kind of work in tandem with Trump, and with them not, Powell says they're not controlled by politicians. Can they make this more difficult?
Well, they can certainly make it more difficult. Having said that, central bankers are controlled by politicians.
Okay.
Anybody who thinks that central banks are independent, even the Fed, that's what they teach you in business school. It's not the real world. Now, do they have a great autonomy? And can they do things without the approval of the Congress? Absolutely. But if they do too many things that the Congress doesn't like, that chairman's going to be gone very quickly. And even if the law doesn't allow for that, the law will get changed. So again, countries will do what they need to do, to get through any situation that they need to get through. So that's number one. Number two, I don't necessarily think they need to raise rates, to keep the dollar strong. The dollar is already very strong versus its peers. And rates still being at 4.5% or 5% is still much higher than much of the rest of the world. And much of the rest of the world has the same problems that we do. And much of the rest of the world has already started cutting rates as well. And that's why the fact that, Trump's trade policies are keeping the dollar strong. But the other reason the dollar is strong is that the other currencies are falling because those countries are cutting rates, some of them aggressively, and are probably going to have to go back to QE, right? So that's number one. Number two, I think Trump wants a strong dollar, but I don't think he wants a rapidly rising dollar. A rapidly rising dollar causes lots of problems for the entire system. Now, he might not. Here's the thing. The dollar going stronger right now is putting incredible pressure on the rest of the world, which makes it easier, or will make it easier, for Trump to negotiate. Because if you're in an okay situation and the other guy is in an increasingly desperate situation, you have negotiating power, right? So I don't think Trump minds a strong dollar. I don't think he minds a rising dollar on a short-term basis. I don't think he wants a rising dollar consistently, because that just crushes the whole world and deals don't get done and all kind of bad things happen then. But let's say that he wants a weaker dollar. Let's say he wants a weaker dollar in order to um, stimulate growth or whatever his policies are. The problem with that is that's going to be counter to his inflation fighting mandates. But also, even if they do start cutting rates and the dollar falls, it would have to mean that the Fed is cutting more aggressively than the rest of the world, which I think is possible but unlikely. But the tariffs, in many ways, a tariff is almost like a rate hike. So they could cut 1%. But if he's putting 10% tariffs on China and 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and I don't know, whatever he puts on Brazil and India and Russia, that decreases the circulation of dollars. So it has the ability in many ways to offset the rate cuts. And that's why I say that, it's going to be, some of Trump's policies are counterintuitive and counterproductive to each other. But there will be problems in the global economy. And when problems happen in the global economy, dollar typically rises. Now, I'm the first to say that perhaps the Fed comes in and cuts aggressively. And the dollar index goes from, I think it's at 107 today. Maybe it goes back to 102. Maybe it goes to 98. Maybe it goes to 95. I don't know. But if that happens, that's central bankers and monetary authorities and Trump, and that's them remaining in control. That's them having, their finger on the mechanism and it going the way they want. The dollar going higher very quickly, that's people losing control. That's the Fed, no longer having control of the currency. And so the dollar going lower, credit expanding, stock markets rising, that's the continuation of the status quo. It's when the dollar goes higher that bad things happen. Now, the last thing I'm going to say, and I want to say before I forget, but it goes back to your question about QE. The Fed is not going to go do QE unless they want the dollar weaker. Now, the reason they would want the dollar weaker is that it's too strong. So in other words, if there's too much demand for the dollar and it's going up, then the Fed will go in and create supply. But it's the Fed reacting to, in other words, the dollar is the cause and QE is the effect. In other words, I think there's a lot of people who say the Fed will do QE and the dollar will fall. Well, it's actually the other way around. The dollar's too strong, so the Fed has to do QE to weaken it. Does that make sense?
It does.
But if they're fighting inflation and they're trying to slow the economy, it's hard to see them cutting aggressively unless it's part of some wider negotiated deal with other countries and other monetary authorities. And I don't rule that out. That's possible. I think we kind of got to wait and see if that happens. But, in many, many ways, the struggles that the U.S. has, the challenges that the U.S. has, they still sit atop the pyramid of monetary hegemony, military hegemony, economic hegemony, political hegemony for the whole world. And so while Trump has many challenges ahead of him, and it's not going to be easy, for a deal maker like Trump, he has a lot of tools at his disposal that I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with. And part of the reason they're unfamiliar with them is because the U.S. hasn't used them for decades. But just because they haven't used them doesn't mean they don't have them.
Well, Trump put Jay Powell in his position, so we'll see whether whether they continue to work well together or whether Trump finds a problem with them. That'd be determined. Talk about the bond market for a minute, because that affects my business significantly, especially the 10-year bond. What do you expect for that? And, how will that affect mortgage rates over the next 12 months?
Well, so this is going to go back a little bit to the beginning when we started talking, and that in general, all things equal, and it's funny that I say all things equal because I typically hate it when people say all things equal, because you're never in a situation where all things are equal. Things are always changing. Having said that, my base case is that rates stay at this level or go higher, because I think
mortgage rates. Mortgage rates, or you're talking about the Fed rate?
The 10-year rate.
Okay, 10-year.
I think 10-year.
That's what I asked, right?
I don't necessarily think the Fed is going to cut. I don't expect them to raise. And maybe they'll cut a little bit, but I don't expect them to cut at the same rate that many people think they're expecting them to cut. I don't think they're going to cut in December. They might, but I actually think that they won't. But we're still going to have this big budget, even if Vivek and Elon come up with some plan to cut government spending. The government is still going to spend a heck of a lot of money. They may cut some certain departments, but my guess is that money ends up getting spent somewhere else. And so the government is going to have to issue or is going to issue a lot of bonds. So there'll be a lot of supply. And as supply comes in, then I think rates go higher. And I think here's the thing is part of the reason that rates are high in the U.S. is that they can be high in the U.S. The U.S. can afford to pay higher rates because the U.S. can print the currency it needs to service them. Now, I know a lot of people think that we're in desperate times and we're going to have this. The whole world is going to stop buying treasuries, and the U.S. is not going to be able to fund its government. I am not in that camp at all. Now, the U.S. may have to offer higher rates in order to keep getting them, but they will fund. Other entities will still fund the government. And if they don't, then the U.S. has ways of making them fund the government. So in other words, there won't be a situation where the U.S. cannot get financing, but Germany can get financing and China can get financing. Again, it goes back to a relative game. If the U.S. can't get financing, then nobody can get financing.
Yeah. You think this is why we're seeing mortgage rates trending higher right now?
I do. Yeah.
So you think that would continue?
You know this area better than I do, but in my world, almost the whole world is priced off the 10-year bond, right? And so if 10-year rates go up, I think it'd be pretty rare to see the 10-year rate going up and mortgage rates crashing. Maybe I'm missing something, but I think that would be unlikely. Now, here's what I would say though. So in general, I think rates tend to go higher unless they crash. In other words, I don't think that they slowly tick down and go lower. I think they stay here or go higher unless there's some kind of a crisis, in which case leads to people rushing to treasuries as a safe haven, and the yield goes from 4.5% to 2.5% over a couple weeks or something like that.
Yeah, that would take a major event for that to happen, is what you're saying. Yeah. I want to pull up this mortgage rate chart here on cnet.com and kind of get your opinion on this. It looks like you've got Fannie Mae, National Association of Realtors, Wells Fargo, and the Mortgage Bankers Association have put out their predictions for the remaining of this year and then going through the quarters of 25. And it looks as if all of them in Q2 are showing mortgage rates under 6%. As we get into Q5, I think we're seeing where that continues to trend down. Do you think these predictions are wrong based on what you're saying with the bond market and the 30-year fixed rate sort of following that 10-year?
Well, if they had these rates dramatically lower than they are now, I would say it's wrong. Again, unless there's some kind of a crisis or a crash. And in general, I think they're wrong, but perhaps not dramatically. Again, I don't necessarily think 10-year rates are going to 8 or 9%. I just don't think that they're going to come down in an easy and measured way. And my guess would be that unless we have some kind of a crisis in the first 6 to 9 months of 2025, I expect yields to go higher into the first part of 2025.
Yeah, that would blow these projections, away. And look, this is sort of what we're dealing with in our world because the housing market is basically stalled. Homes have appreciated nationwide 80 to 100% in just 5 years. And what we're seeing now is with these rates hovering somewhere around 7% right now, you can get in the sixes, but for the most part, conventional mortgages are 7%. Do you think? I mean, I know we've talked about this before. We've had some differences of opinion on where things, at least in the housing market, are headed. I mean, looking at everything now, do you believe that we're in a housing bubble?
I guess I don't think so. Right. There's still great demand for housing. Right. And in many places, inventory is still low. Now, I do agree that prices are very high. And so is it a bubble? Sometimes I think of a bubble as when prices are really high, but there's no demand at all. Right. And so there is great demand, but prices are very high. So I think it's very possible we see a downtick in prices. But I do not see housing being the cause of a crisis the way 2028 was. Or sorry, 2008. Yes.
Yeah.
I would be more willing to put commercial real estate into the cause of a crisis as opposed to residential real estate. I mean, the reality is that I saw this. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but I saw a figure that it surprised me, and it showed how many homes in America are actually paid off and fully owned, and it was a number that was higher than I remembered, and it also showed the amount of equity that's sitting in houses, and it was higher than I would have thought. Now that doesn't mean that there's not people underwater, but coming out of 2020, a lot of housing was bought. Maybe not with conventional mortgages, maybe they sold crypto stuff and they bought it, or, maybe they sold some stock portfolios and bought it. Maybe they borrowed against their stock holdings and bought it. But I feel like even if prices could come down 20%, that would probably be a good thing for the average American, and it wouldn't necessarily cause a crisis for the people that already own them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm explaining this right.
No. I think there's a lot of what you're saying we've found to be so. I think we have seen a lot of cash purchases, especially over really since March of 22 when interest rates started going up, and we started seeing parents financing the homes for their kids if they had the cash to do so. Sure. I think what we are seeing though, on a pretty large scale, a nationwide scale, is we are seeing inventory getting back to pre-pandemic levels, and in a time when it's very odd to see that, when you're looking at just coming up on the holiday season, and we're looking at inventory levels that are, going back 5-6 years, highs of 5-6 years ago. And we are starting to see now where it's the combination of everything together. I think at one point, when 22 happened, I was saying, look, we would probably see some kind of a median price adjustment of 10 to 15%. We've seen that. We've seen that happen, and we are seeing larger discounts happening. But you're right. When you're looking at 50 to 80% price hikes over the last 5 years, it seems kind of insignificant. But what we are seeing now is that the sellers need to do a lot more to sell their house, where, in that time of exuberance, people were buying it as is. Broken things didn't matter. The functional obsolescence didn't matter. They just wanted the house, and that would be the only way that they would get it. So now we're starting to see where sellers are actually dipping in their pockets $20,000, $30,000 in repairs and replacements and putting new roofs on and things. So it'd be interesting.
My mother-in-law in Cal, and like she's in Silicon. She was in Silicon Valley, and very hot market, and houses go up and they're bought with cash 2 days later for X amount over.
Yeah.
Asking, and she was able to sell hers very quickly and for a very good price, but she had to make some improvements, right?
Yeah.
And and it was worth it, but it was necessary.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the dollar a little bit more. I want to kind of dive back into that. Trump's talking about decreasing, with Doge, the national debt, cutting waste, fraud, and abuse within the government. I think a lot of people think there's a lot of that. Will this be enough, in itself to prevent printing more dollars? I mean, do you think that there's enough money to save with Doge?
Well, I think the first thing I'll say is the national debt's never going to go down. They are not going to pay off the debt. They're not going to pay down the debt, let alone pay it off. It's just not going to happen. So anybody who thinks it is crazy. And the other thing is, I know this is going to I already know how this is going to sound, and I don't want to sound like I'm out of touch and don't understand. But a government is different than an individual, because a government, until a revolution comes along, is a perpetual entity, right? So there is no, as long as they can roll the debt, it can continue to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And someday, will there be a horrible consequence? Probably, right? But they're never going to pay it off. It will just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so, can the rate of growth slow? I think the answer is yes. Will the rate of growth slow? I think that's a very big wild card. But can they cut the budget, or can they cut waste out of the budget? They can absolutely cut waste out of the budget. My guess is that the budget deficit will not fall. It's just that money will now be spent somewhere else that Trump thinks is more efficient or less wasteful. But I do think waste will be cut. I don't think there's any. But here's the thing: you have to remember. Then this goes back to why I think 2025 can be pretty tough, is because government spending is a big part of GDP. If the government doesn't spend as much, then those companies that receive those payments aren't going to receive as big of payments, and the people that work for those companies aren't going to get raises, and they're not, they're probably, and many of them might get fired, right? And so cutting spending is, all else equal, is cutting GDP, right? And so I think the Doge committee is extremely important for a couple of reasons. One, because I think the people want it. And it goes back to the thing we said at the very beginning, is you have to change the mood of the people. And so I think one of the ways that Trump did that was this Doge committee, right? We're going to bring accountability back to the government who's been screwing you over for all these years. And that's why I think they need to have it now, and they need to do some cuts that are big and flashy to show that we're doing something. Now, like all politicians, Trump is probably going to be doing a little bit of sleight of hand, right? He may be cutting a big department here, but I'm sure certain governments or certain companies that have government contracts, Tesla, I don't think their contracts are going to get cut, right? Or SpaceX, I don't think his contracts are going to get cut. And perhaps rightly so, right? If he can put more rockets into space at a cheaper and more efficient rate than NASA, then why not? But I don't think Trump wants a recession. I think he wants a great economy. I don't think he wants increasing unemployment. So for him to just cut the budget 25% and deal with the ramifications without also spending that money somewhere else or doing something else, I think is highly unlikely. Even though he may want to do it, I think the circumstances probably prevent him from doing it. But I think he can direct it in a more efficient manner.
Let's touch on cryptocurrency, because I know Trump has, he talked about this in his campaign. He spoke at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville. I want to bring your memory back. And one of and I encourage people to, all of Brent's links are in the show notes, to check him out, follow him on YouTube. And it's amazing, because one of the ways, and they're going to do this to me in a couple of years on, me talking about the housing market the way I have. We'll see whether I'm right or wrong, or, or anything that we say, right, when we're documenting.
Right.
But you went on video. I want to pull this up, and I want to play a quick clip 2 years ago. And Brent, this is why I like listening to you talk, because you bring a very, pragmatic and but profound approach to the topic of the economy and the dollar and things like that, where a lot of other people they will talk about whether it's gold or crypto or whatever. You look at everything, and you have this insight with you that is it's very interesting to go back and watch and then talk to you today. But I want to pull up this clip here. Blockworks Digital Asset Summit. You were part of a panel. You probably remember. So we want to give them credit because if you go to Blockworks Macro's YouTube channel, which I had the link below, you'll see it as well. And this is as it was, you were talking about, you were a follow-up on talking about the impact, the potential impact of Bitcoin. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like right now, they can coexist. It's an asset. It's a store value, however, a reserve, however you want to describe it. But if Bitcoin does what many people in this room think it's going to do, and it continues to grow its adoption and rise in value, it will inevitably come into conflict with the global reserve currency or with the dollar, and it is inherently political. If you read the white paper, the title has the word cash in it, and in the second paragraph, it says money system. And the government doesn't like competition.
So I guess you remember that.
Yeah, I do.
Right. Yeah. So can you kind of, 2 years later now, Trump just spoke at the Bitcoin conference, and so did RFK and a lot of people, right? What do you think is unfolding here with whether it's crypto or Bitcoin? What are you expecting? What kind of disruption here? Are you seeing this play out the way that you had envisioned 2 years ago?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that Bitcoin is up 5x since that interview. So I think Bitcoin was around 20 or 25,000 when that interview took place, and now it's pretty close to 100,000. So, and what I've always said, or at least for as long as I can remember, is that Bitcoin is the purest play on global liquidity that I can think of. And so I see and remember, I think that video is from September of 2022, August or September of 2022.
Yes.
And if you remember, that is the point at which interest rates had been hiked aggressively for all of 2022. Up to that point, the dollar had risen precipitously. Stocks were down 20 or 30% or whatever they were. Bitcoin had gone down, I think 50 or 60% so far that year. And subsequent to that, though, the Fed stopped hiking. They started talking about cutting. And since then, they've actually done some cutting. And countries around the world have stopped cutting and started providing stimulus. And you've seen Bitcoin react to that global liquidity, or at least react to the liquidity disappearing, and reacted to the new liquidity coming back on by going up 5 times or 4 or 5 times. And so the point that I've tried to make with Bitcoin is I think it's a very innovative asset. Can it be seen as a store of value? I suppose it can be seen as a store of value. I'm not against Bitcoin, and I actually really like it from a conceptual standpoint. Where I have a problem is those who say it's going to replace the US dollar or it's going to become the global reserve currency. Just because something goes up in value doesn't mean that it's going to be the new global reserve currency. Doesn't mean that it can't be a part of your portfolio. And I've said before, if Bitcoin could go to $1 million, I don't know how high it can go. But the idea that countries are going to adopt it and use it as their base currency, I think is to misunderstand money in the first place. And what I mean by that is I think this is a little bit of a derivative of living in the time that we live. Even though you could probably argue that over the last 10 or 20 years, our liberties have started to be taken away. In general, we live at a time of world history where liberty has never been greater, right? We are offered more freedoms than many times we have in the past. Economic freedom, political freedom, freedom of speech. Now, again, I understand that those are kind of, maybe the pendulum is starting to swing back the other way, but you go back throughout history And, it was a much less free world. But regardless of where you go throughout history, money has always been used by a government as a tool to get their own revenue, but to also control their populations. And the idea that a country is going to willingly give away control over or hand away their biggest tool that they have and just let the free market take care of everything, I think is disproven by history itself. Now, people will say that we had periods where we were on a gold standard. Well, yes, we did have periods where we were on a gold standard, but when we were on those periods, typically the government set the price. It typically wasn't a market determined price. And when that happened, the government controlled the supply. And over time, all of those gold standards ended up breaking, or the governments ended up leaving those gold standards because they didn't like the control of the free market having more control than they do, right? They didn't like to have their government spending curtailed. They didn't like being subservient to an inanimate object. And so the point I was getting at on that video, it doesn't mean that governments can't allow it. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to ban it. It doesn't mean they can't own it and put it on the central bank's balance sheet. But they're not, in my opinion, they are not going to willingly let a free market chosen token be their currency of the realm. And if and when it ever gets to a point where that becomes a serious consideration, I think there will be an epic battle. And I don't think it's a given that the government loses that battle. And so, again, you kind of have to understand the nature of money and you have to look at it from the government's point of view. Stop looking at it from an individual's point of view. Very rarely in history do individuals get to choose how things are. It's usually dictated to us from above. Now, we're coming up on 250 years of perhaps the greatest political experiment in history of letting individuals self-govern themselves. Again, I'm not sure people realize how unique that is. It's extremely unique, and it's so unique that it's actually the pendulum is starting to swing the other way, and in many ways, I think we're becoming less free rather than more free. But that 250 years of governance, I think, influenced the way that many of us, specifically Americans and even many in the West, think today. I think they think about money differently today than they did 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And cycles repeat throughout history. And I'm not convinced that the future involves a free market chosen money.
What would a battle look like? I mean, would they just pull the plug? Would it all of a sudden there be a glitch in the system and, the internet goes down? I mean, what would be the battle?
So I'm not predicting that they're going to do this. I'm just saying I think there's many things they could do. Number one, they could say, yeah, you can own it, but you can't pay for other goods and services with it. You can keep it, but all new transactions are taxed at 85%, right? Capital gain windfall profits tax is 75%, and it's retroactive 10 years. Now, I know people are saying, well, that's just dramatic. That's theft. Well, yeah, of course. That government steal. Congratulations. Welcome to the real world. That's what governments do, right? And so again, this isn't a prediction. I'm just saying, or they could say, the crypto can no longer interface with traditional financial companies that are regulated by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve, and the Treasury Department. And so whether they do this, I don't know. I'm just saying there's many tools that they could use to do this.
Well, what you're saying makes sense. I mean, right. I mean, you control the money, you're in control, you remain in control. And,
right.
And I think you're 100% right. I want to talk about Trump was just there was a Bloomberg.com article. It says Trump is pledged to make the U.S. the global home for crypto by fostering supportive regulations as well as a national Bitcoin stockpile. I mean, when I read this, the first thing, or even when hearing Trump talking about it at the Bitcoin conference, it makes it very hard for me, just like you explained. Why would anyone be endorsing a one currency. And that would be crazy in itself. But do you think that we will have some type of crypto that will CBDC? Do you think that will really exist here?
Well, so this kind of gets it back to what we were talking about before. Is before the U.S. would adopt a Bitcoin as its currency, I think they would launch their own. And again, the government does not like competition. So if and when they launch their own CBDC, the idea that they're going to allow Bitcoin or Tether or something else to freely participate versus it, I think is a bit naive. Now, do I know for sure that they're not going to? No, I don't. Maybe they will, but the people, again, I don't really have a problem with Bitcoin until people tell me that it can't possibly lose and there's nothing the government can do to stop it. That's where I take issue with it, right? I think the future is digital. I think we will have digital currencies. In many ways, the dollar is already digital, where we send ones and zeros across phone lines and internet cables all the time. There's not that actual much physical currency in the world anymore. So the delivery method and the way you track it and the ledger that it gets posted to is a bit different. And I think there's a lot of innovative technology that's come out of the crypto adoption over the last 10 or 15 years. And I expect the government to adopt some of that. I just don't expect the government to adopt a Bitcoin as its own, currency. The other thing I'd say is one of my biggest pet peeves in the world is hypocrisy. And I'm sure that somebody out there can dig up clips of mine where I've contradicted myself and I'm guilty of it. But I try not to be guilty of hypocrisy because it drives me crazy. And so I find it kind of funny that this anarcho-capitalist digital currency that the free market loves is all of a sudden embracing politicians endorsing it. This has always been, to get out of the system. This is the trade to exit the system. But now you want the president and his cabinet ministers to adopt it as their own. I would think you would want them to be as far away from it as possible. And so, I get a little bit of entertainment out of that aspect of it. At the end of the day, I think there's a lot of well-intentioned people in the digital asset space. I think there's a lot of charlatans in the digital asset space. But the one thing that I think that is proven is that whether they're the well-intentioned ones or the charlatans, everybody wants the price of their asset to go up, and everybody thinks that government is a horrible actor until they start buying the asset that they own, and then it's a really smart decision. In other words, politicians are stupid about everything except when it comes to buying the asset that I already own. Then they're geniuses.
I just think about what it would be like to have a currency that fluctuates in value from day to day. I mean, I don't think about the dollar going up or down. I mean, if I have money in my pocket and I go out and I want to buy something, I go and I buy it. I don't think, well, if I buy it tomorrow, I may be thinking about a sale if a store is going to have a Black Friday sale, but I'm not thinking about, well, gee, should I buy that TV or these groceries today or tomorrow? Is my money going to be worth more tomorrow? Yeah. Is it a bad day to buy? Oh man, I shouldn't have bought. I should have waited because now the value has gone up so much in 24 hours. I just think it's our ideals. I mean, I think things are getting weird. Brent, I want to kind of wind up here with China. Your thoughts on China? I watch a lot of. Let's just say I watch a lot of YouTube. Whether that's good or bad or indifferent. But a lot of people are people that have been either working for an agency or have been in the military. Have been talking about recently China, and it's wanting to be a superpower, obviously, and that there's this date of 2030. I know you following these financial markets or the global financial markets very closely. What can you share, or what are your opinions on this 2030 agenda, and China becoming this superior global superpower, wanting to beat out or challenge the U.S. in a lot of ways? We see some conflict potentials, with it's all over the news right now, the geopolitical issues and the tensions that are mounting. Thoughts on this?
Well, I'm going to say this name wrong, so forgive me. But there was a book written 2 or 3 years ago. I think it was called The Thucydides Trap, which is basically about, two global powers in the world. Do they inevitably have to go to war, or is there a way to peacefully coexist? And I would like to say that there is a way to peacefully coexist. And I think it's possible that from time to time you can peacefully coexist. But if you give it enough runway, they will eventually come into great conflict. And unfortunately, and here's the thing, I know I probably come across as like this really negative Debbie Downer, but I'm actually not. I'm actually a pretty happy guy. I like to think of myself as an optimist, even though I have some very cynical views. But I as a student of history, it tells me that I've referenced this pendulum swinging, right? And I think when I grew up in the 80s and 90s, that was probably the ultimate expression of globalization and the golden age of travel. You could pretty much go anywhere in the world. Everybody was, for the most part, getting along. But I think those days are behind us, and I think we are swinging the other way now. I think we're becoming a more fractured world. I think China, in many ways, has many problems that the rest of the world doesn't quite understand, both externally and internally. And I think they're struggling with many of those things right now. And part of the thing that has led to the incredible growth in China is that they kind of made this grand bargain with their citizens that said, you are going to have to work incredibly hard, but it's all going to be worth it because, it's almost their manifest destiny to become the next global hegemon. And, we're going to take many of you from the agrarian agricultural world and we're going to bring you into our mega cities, and you're going to build our roads and our factories and our banks and our, water systems. And we're going to build highways, and we're going to build high-speed rail. And you're going to work 20 hours a day, and the wages aren't going to be very high. But some of you are going to get fantastically rich in the and China is going to be the global leader of the 21st century. And that's a very powerful dream. It's a very powerful motivator. It kind of goes back to what I said at the very beginning with Trump in the United States. You've got to get people to believe in something, right? And I think in many ways, the Chinese citizens have believed in that. And as long as as long as the China continues to expand and grow, and its place on the global stage continues to rise, then I think that continues. The problem is if anything ever happens to dent that dream, then they start to say, are all these sacrifices really worth it? And over the last 2 or 3 years, their stock market has crumbled, their real estate market has crashed. All the money that the people have saved and put into real estate is no longer going up at the rate it was. And in fact, it's going down. Their jobs aren't as plentiful. Their food costs have gone up. And so they have challenges internally, right? And I think that if and when there comes some kind of a conflict with the United States and China doesn't handily defeat the United States, I think that causes them even more internal conflict. The same would be true of the United States. If the United States came into some conflict with China and China decisively beat the United States in that battle, that would be a very hard thing for the American psyche to handle, right? So, but the idea that it doesn't work in reverse, that's silly. Of course it works there too. And so I think the economic situation in China is fairly dire. And if you don't mind, I'm gonna do a shameless plug here. A friend of mine and I started a research service about 6 months ago. It's called Macro Alchemist. If you go to macroalchemist.com, you can download a number of the reports. We did a very big report on China and its real estate market. We did another, big report on carry trades and why when one fiat currency rises versus another fiat currency, it causes all kinds of problems. I think if you read those reports, you're going to understand why China is in the situation it's in. And I think as they increasingly come under economic pressure, they are going to increasingly use the strategy that all governments have used throughout history to explain why they're having trouble internally. And that is they're going to blame the mean foreigner, right? Listen, countries have used this forever. The United States has used this many times. When you get into trouble at home, what do? You start a conflict with somebody over there, right? And you blame all the problems on the person over there. Maybe you even start a war with the person over there. And hopefully that then pulls you out of the doldrums. It creates some animal spirits, and it, tries to bring the country together, some kind of uniform activity. And so I think that's kind of where things are headed. I've called this a Game of Thrones before, and I think it's pretty accurate. I think we're at a point in history where all countries have gotten themselves into trouble economically and from a debt perspective. And as a result, their economies are struggling. And as their economy's struggling, I think they're going to do increasingly hostile towards their enemies. And unfortunately, I think that leads to some conflicts. And so I think China falls right into that.
Interesting. Is that why you're in Puerto Rico?
Part of the reason.
Now you can tell us. Well, Brent, I really appreciate your time and great information. And again, I encourage everybody to check out that. We didn't even talk about your dollar milkshake theory, but we've spoke about it before. And I think you're a very bright mind, and we need to keep listening to you. So thanks so much, and look forward to having you back again soon.
Well, thanks for having me on, and I hope you guys all have a great end of the year.
Same to you. Hey, thanks for making it to the end. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, you can let us know by hitting that thumbs up. Also, if you haven't subscribed to Sachs Realty's YouTube channel, consider doing so now. Hit that alert bell. You'll know every time we upload content just like this. Keep those comments and questions coming. I love reading them, and the engagement is amazing. Together, we'll continue to build the most incredible online community, talking about everything real estate and the U.S. economy. See you next time. Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.